Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Bob Rose. I'm the Principal Product Marketing Manager for DNS, DHCP, and IPAM, and Value-Added Services at Infoblox, the market leader in core network and security services for the hybrid multi-cloud environment. In recent years, the growth in both cloud and decentralized computing has meant enormous flexibility for companies both large and small. And with that flexibility, however, has come dramatic increase in the complexity with respect to IP address management. And of course, not only do the traditional IPAM challenges remain, which include avoiding IP conflicts and outages, rapid provisioning and deprovisioning, visibility, synchronization, and more. But gathering information from disparate locations, and especially from cloud services, can involve extensive and ongoing manual labor. Now, Infoblox can help organizations deal with these challenges, but we wanted independent validation. So we contacted the Tolly Group, a premier independent test lab, a provider of third-party validation services, and the leader in cloud and virtualization benchmarking. And Tolly tested Infoblox's DDI and cloud capabilities and produced a Tolly test report entitled Authoritative IPAM for DNS and DHCP with automated cloud and on-premises network discovery with a 3-year total cost of ownership evaluation. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us today Kevin Tolly, CEO and founder of the Tolly Group, and he's here to talk with us about some of the report highlights. Kevin, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate you coming today.
Hey, Bob, good to see you. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Well, Kevin, this report that you developed covered 3 areas: a multi-cloud network discovery, on-prem discovery, and of course, the TCO, which we first looked at back in 2015. And so why don't we go ahead and jump right into our first topic, which is multi-cloud network discovery. So Kevin, what is the issue? Can you frame that up for us? How did you explore it?
Sure. So the IP address discovery process is manual, and it is understandably different for each cloud service. So what we did is to simply log in to the 3 major services, AWS, GCP, and Azure, and simply document the process. Essentially, just document what a real user would have to do.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. So what did you find?
Well, we found that the manual process was even more tedious than anticipated. Using AWS as an example, we found that to discover all my AWS addresses, one would have to log in to a given data center, navigate to the first virtual private cloud, VPC, and then drill down into individual instances to get the IP address information. Then, when you're done, you go back up and over to the next VPC and back down again. When you're done with all your VPCs, you have to enter the next data center and do the same thing. So to find an address manually and document that address varied a little across the various cloud services, but it was always a little more or less than 1 minute. That simply doesn't scale. As soon as you finish, you might need to begin the process again, given the dynamic nature of cloud environments. So for the Infoblox side, we defined each cloud service to be accessed by the Infoblox API and let it begin its search. A short while later, all the address information was there in the GUI. We scheduled an automatic refresh period and we were done. We had a single source of truth for all my cloud services, integrated, and this is important, integrated into a single screen, automatically updated.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a very involved process. You mentioned how important that is. Can you go into that in a little more detail?
Sure. It's important because it shows that manually tracking IP addresses is simply not practical for any but the smallest cloud environments, right? Think about it. If you have 1,000 IP addresses, you're talking about 16 hours of work to go through it once. At the end of this, you have a big spreadsheet with lots of IP address information, and you really need to start right all over again to make sure it remains correct. So with Infoblox, after the initial configuration, which was fairly minimal, almost trivial, we have all of our addresses presented as noted, integrated into a single screen, and updated according to whatever refresh period I choose. So the Infoblox API makes all the difference, Bob. So that's your department. It's your API.
Well, for sure, and to give our listeners a little bit of insight on that, Infoblox V Discovery actually pulls all of that rich metadata, like device information, manufacturer, the operating system, what version it is, authentication information, DNS queries, IP addresses, all of the other DHCP fingerprinting data, and it pulls that from public and private cloud, hybrid cloud platforms using cloud native APIs. And as it gathers the data on VPCs and VNets and subnets and VMs and other IPs, it brings all of that together. And I think you mentioned it, Kevin, into a single unified IPAM view.
Yep,
And
very
from there,
important.
then we have robust APIs that allow for integration with cloud native tool sets like Terraform and Ansible and Kubernetes. And there's a number of other ones to help orchestrate and automate the management of cloud environments. And we even have templated plugins for many of those tools to help streamline the process. So that's a little bit behind the scenes on the API with regard to cloud applicability. Now, so Kevin, let's change gears for just a moment. And we've just talked about cloud. Let's talk about the on-prem network discovery.
Right.
What's the issue there? How did you explore that?
So there are a few issues, right? Many network admins might have been using basic freeware or commercial tools to scan their networks. Some of these tools might have provided basic information, but again, might require manual documentation of the addresses. That's always bad. Manual documentation is not to be trusted, right? The other issue is that post-pandemic work from anywhere has spawned many more premises to look after for many companies, many more physical locations. Thus, the tools in use might no longer be appropriate for the task at hand. Because there are so many options for commercial freeware network scanners, we didn't look at those, but rather focused our evaluation on what Infoblox could do.
Well, yeah, that's very important. You've kind of talked about almost a siloed reality there. What did you find
Yeah, so
from your test?
yeah, so again, we found that after a basic configuration of Infoblox and giving it some time to scan the test networks, obviously it'll vary depending on how big the network is, all the IP addresses were presented to us on the integrated Infoblox GUI. So what is important also is the depth of information provided, not just for end user stations, but for network infrastructure as well. From what we saw, Infoblox can tell you that a given IP address, for example, is a Cisco switch running a particular firmware version, and will also provide you with the device serial numbers along with other information.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds very, very important. Can you go into a little more detail? Give us some additional commentary on that.
Sure. So why it's important for sure. So just as with multi-cloud scenario, the manual approach would likely be much more time consuming, right? Depending on which manual approach you choose, and would lack the integration that Infoblox has between on-prem and cloud. That's very, very important. You don't want to be moving around all the time. So again, needing to access individual networks and scan for IP addresses, if you're using, for example, a low-end commercial tool, would be very time consuming and require repeated scans daily or weekly to keep the information up to date. Again, doing it all manually. With Infoblox, you don't need that. Infoblox does all this automatically. So my turn to ask a question, Bob. What's the secret sauce here?
You're asking us to give away our secrets now.
Absolutely.
Well, so Infoblox, of course, uses a variety of built-in configurable discovery tools, including both scheduled and periodic polling. So these would be things like SNMP, CLI, port, BIOS, and other types of collection tools. Plus, we do inheritance from the existing network data to pull information from DNS, DHCP network, perhaps other authentication logs. And all of that metadata, Kevin, is captured automatically and then natively without having to do any CSV uploads. And what this does is it creates content aware workflows. And those workflows traverse protocol and device and port and IPAM data to really enrich the data set and
Okay.
to integrate into DDI on-prem processes. And so this really increases visibility. It avoids the IP conflicts and outages that we talked about a little bit ago,
Right.
and of course the inefficiency to deliver reliable, stable operating environments, both in terms of on-prem or in the private or hybrid multi-cloud.
Yep. Good
So,
stuff.
so that's a little bit of insight behind the scenes as to what's going on. So Kevin, we've known you for a while, and back in 2015, we did the TCO report originally. That was the total cost of ownership with regard to IPAM IP address management versus manual,
Right.
and we looked at that, and we took a look at this again. What's the issue there? How did you explore it?
So right, the issue here was to quantify the effort required to conduct certain IP address management tasks manually, and then alternatively using Infoblox. So tasks included adding a static IP, adding a DHCP reservation, adding a new subnet, and so forth. I think we had 7 tasks in all that we measured.
And so, what did you find? Were there any differences?
Well, what we found that what was true in 2015 remains true in 2022 and probably in the future, that manual IP address management remains labor intensive, plain and simple. So using Infoblox, all tasks were completed with significantly less effort.
And it almost kind of goes without asking, but why is this important?
One word, right? Scale. When you start looking at larger networks with lots of changes, the labor costs can really add up. So Infoblox, according to our calculations with our kind of example network, cut the labor effort by an average of 69%. For example, our calculations show a potential 3-year savings of almost $120,000 for an example network with 10,000 addresses, and over $1 million of labor savings for a network that has 100,000 addresses and uses kind of the mix of workload that we were using as an example. So Bob, I've done most of the talking. Maybe you can sum up with what you see as the Infoblox advantage here and elsewhere.
Well, Kevin, and thank you for that. We certainly appreciate your insights. A lot of what we've been talking about here is about delivering TCO value for network administrators and for
Right.
network teams. But really, it goes well beyond that to a higher overall business value, because Infoblox solutions provide a whole variety of different advantages. One in particular is the discovery. That was one of the key advantages that we looked at with regard to this current study. And specifically from a hybrid multi-cloud environment, to establish an authoritative IPAM database. And once you have an authoritative IPAM database, that helps you then to eliminate the IP conflicts and the outages that ultimately cost teams time and money and degrade the overall user experience. And just to digress for a moment, we had a large oil and gas customer that actually ended up using authoritative IPAM, and they went from having over 30 trouble tickets a month to deal with to less than 1 per month. And can you imagine the amount of time and savings, not only in terms of dollar value, but the actual user experience
Right.
that
Downtime
saved?
avoided. Yep.
Absolutely. So in addition to that, Kevin, now you get comprehensive visibility across your entire network. And you pointed this out, and I think it's pointed out in the report, through a single control plane. So that means that instead of having to go into each individual instance, you can see the whole thing from one GUI. And
Yep.
that's a problem that a lot of companies are facing today. All of these siloed different tools that you have to go into, it really is
For
difficult.
sure. Yep.
And then, of course, another issue, a lot of customers that we talk to still deal with manual tools, manual processes. Those are error prone. Every time you have a person that's entering information in, it could be wrong, and
Yeah.
it becomes inefficient, and it requires rework. And Kevin, you talked about something at the start of our discussion around the complexity, and we've talked about this a little bit in terms of, you've got legacy environments, you've got hybrid multi-cloud, modern cloud environments, that gets really complex to manage all of that. So, if you look at it in total, IPAM orchestration, API integrations help to automate the visibility, helps with the provisioning and deprovisioning, control on the existing platforms. It speeds time to value, and really for customers that already have a lot of installations, if we are agnostic and we can work, or we have templated plugins that work specifically for those existing solutions, it improves ROI, and it really helps network and security processes. So if you were to sum all of that together, really Infoblox delivers efficient multi-cloud integrations and automation. It strengthens a DDI visibility and the experience and control, and of course enhances the enterprise data and infrastructure protection. And we're talking security there, because a lot of that metadata can be used for security teams, and it does it not only today but also into the future.
Yep, good stuff.
Does that make sense?
It sure does.
And you certainly have helped us with that. Well, Kevin, as we wrap up our chat today, our listeners can actually find this new test report that you've put together, the Authoritative IPAM for DNS and DHCP with on-prem and cloud discovery with a 3-year TCO. That's actually on infoblox.com. You can also find other Tolly reports. Kevin, you've done some Tolly reports on Blox One DDI, our cloud managed DDI solution, as well as Blox One Threat Defense.
Exactly.
And those are resources that if you go into infoblox.com and look at resources, you can actually search right on Tolly and see those reports as well as others. So very helpful to get those insights. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for your work and for your insights on this project. It's a pleasure working with you. As for our audience, yeah, it's great. Very, very helpful. As for our audience, we hope that you found this time to be very informative, that you'll visit infoblox.com and download your very own copy of this report, as well as some of the other Tolly reports. And Kevin, again, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to engaging with you as you manage your cloud and on-prem, your hybrid environments. Thanks, everyone.